Hi, it's Tash. Welcome to Tash's Library. Today's video is going to be my November wrap-up. I read 10 books in November with an average rating of 3.9. So not the best month, but also not terrible. I read a total of 4,425 pages. 6 of these books were physical books, 3 were ebook, and 1 was audiobook. 8 of them were fantasies, 1 was a science fiction, and 1 was a thriller. And I started 4 new series, continued 2 series, and completed 2 series. The first book I'm going to look at is Magician by Raymond E. Feist. I ended up giving this a 4-star rating, and this fulfilled the prompt published before the year 2000. So this is ultimately a coming-of-age fantasy that follows Pug, who is apprenticed to the court magician. And he and his friends find the strange shipwreck, and this sets off a whole chain of events that change their lives. So this is ultimately a very quick read for me. Despite the length, it was quite a chonker. And very engaging plot with a significant jump in the timeline though, which I found a little bit jarring at times. And it covers this epic time span, has some really edge of your seat moments, and Pug is best characterized in this book, although more so in the first half than in the second. The bind-up I read was apparently originally 2 novels, and they've combined it into one because you'd have Magician Apprentice and Magician Master. So maybe that's reflective of that change in characterization, but I feel I didn't understand Pug the Master as well as I did Pug the Apprentice. So the other characters are a little less fleshed out, and that's one of the flaws of this novel, where I find we don't really get to know their personalities, their motivations, and I didn't find myself getting particularly invested in their plights or their fortunes. They're not very differentiated from each other. For example, 2 characters are Arufa and Liam, and they're described as being very different in disposition, but ultimately their voices and actions don't really reflect this. What was great about this novel was the effective world building. It's this medieval Europe-style world with an intriguing magic system, and the magic is a little less developed at the beginning, and initially I was like, oh, where's the magic? But it does indeed grow. The premise is fascinating. Another flaw though, however, was it's not a great representation of women. There are very few female characters, and these are largely eye candy or used to further the development of male characters. I'm not a fan of this. The strengths of the novel allowed me to overlook this to some extent, but this is probably one of the reasons why I didn't give it a 5. And ultimately, it's a good read. I highly recommend it. It explores political intrigue, colonialism, empire, and it does have fairly standard fantasy tropes, but these are fun. And yes, it's a fun sword and sorcery epic. I really enjoyed it, and I will be continuing the series. For my nostalgia prompt, I had The Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. And this is a book that I read when I was about 12, and I hadn't read it since. And was first published in 1968. It's set in this fictional archipelago of Earthsea. And it follows Ged, who joins a school of wizardry. And it's so beautiful. The prose is so lyrical. It explores these themes of coming of age and the pride and its consequences, friendship, power, balance. And throughout this book, I kept thinking of the quote, with great power comes great responsibility. And it really does delve into that. And you're seeing Ged come to understand that throughout the story. It completely held up to my expectations. I remembered it being amazing, and it was. And I felt so cozy reading it. So this was an easy 5-star read for me, and I plan to continue reading the rest of the series. For my animal prompt, I chose Poison Song by Jen Williams, which is book 3 of the Winnowing Flame trilogy, which is the genre-bending fantasy book with sci-fi and horror elements in it. And it follows 3 main characters: Tor, who's an Eboran seeking a cure for his people who are in decline following the death of the tree god. There's Vin, a noblewoman who studies ancient artifacts. And there's Noon, a fell witch. And the first book follows these 3 characters as they explore the relics of an invasion from ages past. This particular book, once again, I've loved the first 2 installments of this series, and this held up. It's a very character-driven book. The characters are well-rounded and nuanced, with flaws and virtues. No Mary Sue's in sight. And there's a host of both endearing and infuriating support characters as well. There are great animal companions. I love the animal companions. They have personalities of their own. They're so lovable and they're so well fleshed out. There's a very unique enemy, which I can't tell you about because that would be spoilers, because you slowly get to know who they are. The tropes are reworked. So they are fantasy tropes, but they're not presented in the standard way, which makes it really cool. And there's an excellent plot. The story explores themes of belonging, family, both biological and found family, and identity. And it has great LGBTQI representation. I still did prefer the first book, but number 3 was high octane action, very twisty. It had a very strong sense of menace throughout, very high stakes, and the conclusion was satisfying and bittersweet, although it did leave me with a few questions. But 5-star read for me. I loved it. This is probably going to be up there as my top 5 series. For the prompt translation, I picked Blood of Elves by Andrzej Sapkowski. And this is part of the Witcher series. It was first published in Poland in 1994 and then was translated into English in 2008. And most people would know the Witcher series from the game and also the recent Netflix adaptation. But the book series is pretty cool so far. I have read the first two books, which are a compilation of short stories, and I absolutely adored those. And I found it was about time that I actually continued with the series proper. Don't know anything about The Witcher. Follows Geralt of Rivia, who's a witcher, which is basically a human mutated to become a monster hunter. It also follows Triss, a sorceress, Ciri, the granddaughter of the overthrown queen, who's now under the care of Geralt, Dandelion, a bard and friend to Geralt, and then Yennefer of Vengerberg, who's also a sorceress. And all the characters come into this one. This one is a little less about the monster hunting, and it's more about political intrigue, and it's really exploring the political landscape after Sintra was conquered. I probably didn't like it as much because of this, because I felt it could have done with a little bit more Geralt. I love Geralt, and I love the monster hunting. I love coming across the folklore about monsters, and there's less of that in this book. Can be a bit slow in places. I mean, I'm not into political intrigue a lot, so some of those bits became a bit more, they were a bit of exposition for me, really. I didn't love them. But it is still a great book. It does explore what actually makes a monster, who can be categorized as a monster. I mean, does it have to be some monster in a swamp, or can it be the person down the road from you? So that's an interesting premise. It also explores prejudice and conflict and politics and war. And so ultimately, I gave this a 3-star. I do plan to continue the series. I've kind of heard that Geralt you don't get as much Geralt in some of the other books as well. And I'm hoping that's not true, but I will continue it because I do love the premise. For my bookworm game prompt, the name of a bar, I picked The Wolf and the Woodsman by Ava Reid. And just because it sounded like a pretty cool bar to go to. And this is set in a fantasy version of Hungary, drawing on Eastern European folklore. And it follows this holy order of woodsmen who take an annual sacrifice from the village, a girl with magical powers. And this time, however, the woodsmen are attacked by monsters, and Evika and the captain of the woodsmen are the only survivors. We follow their way to try and get back to the capital, and then all of the events that ensue from there. Now, I did not find the world building to effectively draw me into the landscape. I couldn't quite imagine it, so it felt short for me a little bit there. The characterization was fairly good. Evika was a tad annoying at times, and I understand this because she was young, but she was so unreasonable and impulsive and made really stupid decisions. There's a lot of banter, unnecessary tension between the characters. And I know some people love this, and if you love this, then this is a book for you. But I just found that all of this unnecessary tension was really there just to further this enemies to lovers trope. And I don't like romance. I don't like enemies to lovers. So that wasn't great for me. And in fact, my favorite character was a very minor character called Tula, who's a witch. Unfortunately, we don't see very much of her. The ending felt rushed for me, relying on decisions that didn't really make sense. And it was a little bit jarring. It explores interesting themes, however, and I think this was the strength of this novel. So it really explores this clash between paganism and organized religion. And it's sort of reminiscent of The Bear and the Nightingale, but in my opinion, not as good and not as well executed. So there's a deep exploration of myth and belief. However, this is often in the form of exposition, storytelling, which won't appeal to everyone because there's a lot of stories. There's a lot of myth that's told. It also explores the cost of power and the cruelty of which people are capable, which was really interesting. And it had an interesting portrayal of duality, that whole idea of like life cannot exist without death. And one of the quotes I really liked in this is as follows: "In this way, it became the world we know, a world where growth could easily become rot, where peace could easily become pain, a world that had a word for happiness because now there was a word for despair." So this was mentioned in part of the, I guess, kind of an origin story. And I just found that it was really interesting. And I think it really sums up the duality that's set up throughout the novel. Themes and philosophical ideas were redeeming features for me, but ultimately the characters and the pacing of the plot didn't quite work for me. And I feel that if you weren't interested in those philosophical ideas, you may not like this novel as much. But I gave it a 4-star because I love anything to do with the philosophy of religion. For the prompt titled chapters, I picked Children of Blood and Bone by Tommy Adeyemi. This follows 3 POVs. Once again, it's also an African-inspired setting and mythology, but it's a YA novel. However, it does read a little bit dark for YA at times. Fabulous characterization. You're basically following this girl from a village where magic has been completely eradicated, a princess in the palace and her brother. So the plot's exciting, but it's largely predictable. One thing I really did not like about this novel was that the plot was furthered by characters making very illogical and stupid decisions. There's a part near the end, and if you've read it, you know, it's just like, why did you do that? Why? And it was so frustrating. I enjoyed it. The romance elements didn't really work for me. But then again, I'm not a romance reader. I really dislike romance in my fantasy novels. So I think that would have brought it down for me a little bit. If you're someone who enjoys that, then this would be a fun read. And I think it probably would be more appealing to younger readers just because of the way the characters interact. I didn't love that. But ultimately I enjoyed the read, but I don't know if I'll continue the series. It is meant to be a trilogy, and I believe the second book's out already. I don't know. I didn't feel like I really cared what would happen next. And so this will be really a back burner. I haven't got the second book, and I'm not sure I actually will get it. But ultimately, I still gave it, I'll probably give it like a 2.5 star. So I rounded it up to 3 because I did enjoy the mythology. I did enjoy the setting. For Features Depth, I chose Judy Calls by Sandy Mitchell. And this is the 5th installment of a military sci-fi set in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. And the series follows Caiaphas Cain, a commissar, which is a type of political officer of the Imperium, tasked with maintaining morale and loyalty amongst the troops. Now, you've heard me talk about this series. I love this series. And the books are told from Caiaphas's point of view, and it's presented as a compilation of memoirs that are then published by a colleague. Caiaphas is inspired by Edmund Blackadder, and he portrays himself as a self-interested, cowardly liar out to save his own skin. But inadvertently, he always becomes involved in dangerous situations and earns his reputation as a charismatic hero. In this particular book, he is sent to this planet of Peramunda to help quell an insurrection. And as in previous installments, there's great world building, with Mitchell creating this unique geography for the planets, including volcanoes, blistering deserts, and temperate plateau. I loved this book. I love Caiaphas Cain, but there is a little less humor than in the other books, and so it comes across as a much more serious story. There are still high stakes, action-packed scenes, many depths, many depths. However, the general plot outline is quite similar across the books, and book 4 is still my favorite because it veers away from this standard formula a little bit more. But ultimately, I love Caiaphas Cain, and this is a 4 star for me. Now, for the prompt elemental, I had originally decided to read The Kingdom of Copper so that I could continue the Daevabad trilogy. However, I had forgotten that The Lost Metal was coming out by Brandon Sanderson, and the word metal is elemental. I mean, there's all these metals on the periodic table of elements. And so I decided to swap this in because I really wanted to read it. And for anyone who doesn't know, this is the 4th Mistborn Era 2 book. And it follows Wax and Wayne and other beloved characters from the series. Yes, this was interesting. I was expecting an amazing book because Brandon Sanderson's is great at endings, and Mistborn Era 1, The Hero of Ages, was just astounding to me. I was just so surprised by the plot developments, and that ending was just a roller coaster, and I was kind of expecting the same thing from this. And I have to admit, and I don't know if this is an unpopular opinion or not, but this book was a bit of a disappointment to me. I was expecting a 5 star, and I gave it 3 stars. I'm sorry to those people who love it. I know, it was, I think it had more to do with my expectations. Maybe I was expecting something a bit different. But I found that it read more as a thriller than a fantasy. And it didn't really deliver on the twists I expected. And it had a lot of references to the Cosmere. And I think for those people who've read the entire Cosmere, this would be kind of fun, but I haven't read Stormlight Archive. And so I feel that if you haven't read the whole Cosmere, all of those reveals are a little less impactful and kind of meaningless. It just didn't read well for me. It didn't work for me. I found the ending very unsatisfying, and it left questions unanswered, in my opinion. And some of the motivations, decisions of the characters aren't really explored, I thought. However, it was an engaging, fun read. Brandon Sanderson is a pleasure to read. And you had the return of all those great characters from Mistborn Era 2. There's some great action scenes. The world building, as always, is impeccable. impeccable. It's got this great atmospheric steampunk setting. I actually finished my TBR before expected, so I managed to fit another 2 novels into the month. And the first one is a fantasy novel called Fated by Benedict Jacker. And this is the first installment in the Alex Verus series. So it's a typical urban fantasy reminiscent of the Dresden Files. And there is indeed a reference to the Dresden Files early on in the book. And very similar to also Ben Aranovic's Rivers of London. This follows Alex, a diviner, who runs a magic shop in London. And when a mysterious relic is discovered, he and his cursed friend Luna find themselves caught between the competing forces of light and dark. So this is a fun read with an engaging plot, interesting characters, cool magic. There's an intriguing exploration of morality and the impact that one's past has on one's present, which gives the story great depth. However, there were some implausible plot points. There were some confusing jumps in the action where I was, whoa, what just happened? Where are we? And ultimately, I gave this a 3-star. It's fun. I will continue the series. I also listened to an audiobook this month, The Paris Apartment by Lucy Foley. So this is a thriller. That's a little bit different from my normal reading. I loved it. I absolutely loved this book and gave it 5 stars. And it follows Jess, who comes to stay with her brother in his Paris apartment. But when she arrives, he is not there. Isn't contactable on his phone. She has no idea where he is. No one seems to know where he is. And the mystery begins. She comes to know the different occupants of this particular apartment building. They're an eclectic mix of characters who are clearly very good at keeping secrets, and everything is not as it seems. So it is a claustrophobic version of a locked room mystery, although in a building. It's told from different POVs across different timelines. And so, you might jump into the past and then back to the present and different parts of the past as well. So you're gradually coming to understand the story of each of the characters. I thought that was incredibly well executed. The setting is so good. It's atmospheric, genuinely unsettling. Like, I actually felt uncomfortable when she was in this building. Had an incredible plot twist. I did not see anything coming. I did not predict what was actually going on. I guessed at one of the secrets, but ultimately I just did not see the ending coming. It was a very compulsive and satisfying read. It was initially a bit slow, and I found that it's this very slow burn when you're coming to find out what's happening. Things are revealed gradually. The characters are incredibly unlikable. I don't think there's one character I really liked. You still want to know what happens to them. And I listened to this on audio, as I said, and I found it incredibly easy to listen to, and I wasn't distracted, which is amazing. So that said something about the narrator. I found it very, very engaging. It's a 5-star read for me. It really is. I just found that it explored all this idea of appearances, family and secrets, and it was just so well executed. And I really genuinely wanted to find out what was going on, and I was thinking about it, and I thought about it after I'd finished reading it. Amazing. I really recommend it to anyone who enjoys thrillers. I also read my 2 short stories that I pulled. So the first one was a science fiction story called Elements of Pataphysics by Alfred Jarry. So this was initially a story written in French. And this one was weird. It was so weird. I initially hated it and I was like, I can't read this. I'm not going to read this. But I did. I continued. I persevered. So first of all, pataphysics in this is considered the study of the laws which govern the exceptions to science. And it's written in the form of excerpts from essays, letters, speeches, mathematical formulae, all these weird things. It is incredibly absurd. It reads like a textbook, making it incredibly dull. Like it's not written as a story. And it's this mishmash of theology and science. For example, in one section, it calculates the surface area of God with mathematical equations. And if you're interested, by the way, the surface area of God turns out to be the shortest distance between 0 and infinity, whatever that means. Yeah. And I did not enjoy reading this. I hated reading this. I wanted to give it a 1 star. But then the idea sat with me. I was like, wow, okay, this is deep. And it had me thinking about the incompatibility of theology and science, and like this desire for people to reconcile them, even if it makes no sense. Can they exist separately, independently? Do they need to be reconciled? Or do they need to? I don't know. It was fascinating. And so I ultimately gave this a 2 star, just because it's not fun to read. I don't recommend it for the fun to readness, if that's a term. But interesting ideas. The second short story I read was a classic fantasy called Prince Elbrick and the Snake Lady. And this is by Vernon Lee, which is actually a pseudonym for Violet Paget. It follows Elbrick, who is a prince, and he becomes captivated with a tapestry depicting his ancestor and a snake lady. And he comes to gradually learn the story behind it. Now, it's a medieval style fantasy exploring desire and youth and beauty and the repression of women. And I can't tell you much more because I think the joy of this story was coming to find out what actually is happening. And I gave it a 3 star. It was enjoyable. It wasn't my favorites. And I'm starting to think maybe I just don't like short stories, because I don't think I've given any of them over 3 at this stage. And that's it for my November wrap up. It was a bit of a mixed bag in terms of enjoyments and quality, but it was a good month. I read 10 books plus my short stories. And thank you for watching. If you like my videos, please subscribe. It makes me very, very happy. And I'll see you next time.